Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of The Exercise Mechanic. Today, we are joined by Dr. Derek Wilcox. He has his doctorate in sports physiology and performance and a master's in sports kinesiology. And you should also know that he squatted 1,000 pounds at 194 pounds body weight and is also a Class A Highland Games athlete, amongst many other things, including a purple belt, I think, in BJJ as well, and like a whole bunch more stuff that I'm sure that we're going to get into today. So first and foremost, Derek, welcome, man. I'm excited to get to know you further.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a really nice introduction. I'm not sure I deserve it all, but I'll take it.
I mean, from what I've seen online, I think you definitely deserve it all.
That just means the smoke and mirrors are still functioning.
That's funny. It was interesting when I was doing a little bit of research on you leading up to today. There was an interview that you did for Renaissance Periodization, and there was a moment. I don't know if you know which interview I'm talking about here. I think it's on the RP website, or anywho. And there's something in that interview that really stood out to me that I was hoping on opening with today, which is that in that interview, you talk about how there was this list that you kept on your notebook for years and how that drove you forward in the sport of powerlifting. And I thought that was so bloody cool. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that today to open us up.
Yeah, absolutely. If we start at the end of the story, that list is sitting directly in front of me up on a wall framed right now. So it's been ever present since I was, I guess, a sophomore or junior in high school, when I actually figured out what powerlifting was. I fell in love with competing in lifting and had no idea that there was a world of, Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting and strongman and things like that. And I asked my strength coach one day, because I was legitimately getting depressed because I loved doing the little lifting competitions we did. Like, Coach, is there even a way to do this in the real world? And he's like, son, are you an idiot? Yes. And so I started getting on the internet, dial up 56K internet back in the day. And after about 9 or 10 hours, I found a website and it loaded. So I started seeing pictures and videos of all these people lifting weights, and it looked like the most insane thing I'd ever seen. And one of the first people I saw was Chuck Vogelpohl. So he captures everyone's imagination. It's almost universal. And then I started learning more about the numbers and the weight classes and all these things. And then I came across the list of the all-time world records. And ever since I was a little kid watching the Guinness World Records TV show from back in the 90s, I was like, man, all these people are setting records doing completely ridiculous things. At some point, I could figure out how to be the best in the world at something. And when I saw that list, it just all kind of clicked, because I'd been lifting, I loved it, I was making good progress, I felt like I had an understanding of it, and I didn't, but it was enough to get started. And I kept looking at that list next to each weight class: 114, 123, 132, 148, 65, 81, 98, 220, and so on and so forth. And it was every federation that was involved there. It didn't matter where you lifted, how you did it. It was just the highest number per the weight class for squat, bench, deadlift total. And to me, that was the most beautiful thing in the world. And it only gained in beauty as I got more into the powerlifting world, where there's so many arguments about semantics. And, if you lift in this federation, it shouldn't count. And if you deadlift sumo, it shouldn't count. And all these different things. That list was void of politics. It was void of opinion. It was void of anything related to any excuse ever. And I was like, if I can get on that list, that will be something real. And that was my goal. It's like, I need to figure out how I'm going to get on there. It doesn't matter what lift it is, doesn't matter in what context. I just need to get on that list to kind of validate myself. And eventually I did. It took probably another 10 years after that moment, or I guess a little bit longer, 11 years. And I popped up on that list at 181 pounds, squatting 935. So, and then that's the list that is it's framed next to my squat suit, which really did the entire lift for me, in a shadow box. And it's got my name on that list. It's highlighted. And it's been broken since then, but nobody can ever take that moment away from me. For 6 years, I was the best in the world at that. Nobody had ever done that. in the human race before, technically, at that size and the weight, and that's all I ever wanted, like something significant that I could say I was the best.
Yeah, I love that. It's so interesting. I mean, so the weight class is what? It's 81 kg. Is that it?
100.
181 pounds. Yeah. And so I did powerlifting very, very, very briefly. And I've always trained with the power lifts, but I only did a handful of meets. Um, and the heaviest squat that I did in training was, I think, 410 with knee sleeves. And that thing practically folded me in half. And the body weight that I was at the time was 181.
Oh,
And
right on.
so the notion of doing double that, even though you're in supportive gear, more supportive gear, just blows my mind because I can relate to what it feels like to be 181. You know, and it's interesting. When I first got into weight training, someone told me that like the power lifts and strength training is a marathon, not a sprint. And initially, I didn't really understand that, but I really think that your story highlights that truth. That because it was like you were what, you were like 14 when you started weight training. I'd be curious when you like set your sights on that list. I can't remember if you mentioned the age you were when that happened, but like from the time that you decided that that was important to you to the time of accomplishment, like that's 2 decades almost.
For that specific record, I was
Yeah.
probably 15 when I started learning about powerlifting outside of high school competitions, and it was 2011, so I was 24 at that point. So it was, yeah, it's close to a decade just for that one, and then 3 more years that I squatted that 1,000 pounds that you mentioned. And I wasn't super crazy about the quality of the squat for the 181 record, so I knew, like, okay, there's a concept in other sports and record breaking of backing up your record. You have to have something comparable to it. So just to say that the one isn't a fluke, I learned mostly in that concept from drag racing, if you guys are familiar with that. You had to run within 1% of the record run that you made just to back it up and make it actually count. And I said, I need to do something else to back that up, because otherwise, they can just say, oh, it's just some backwoods meet and his best friends were judging and it was 8 inches high, which it might have been, I don't know. But so the lightest person to squat 1,000 pounds kind of backed that up for me. So okay, it's not a fluke. I did it again, and that kind of solidified what I really wanted to achieve. Nobody can really take it away.
So something I'm curious about. So I had a background in powerlifting before I started getting into bodybuilding. I imagine, like yourself, the two of us are probably like strength sport historians. Like I find the sport really fascinating. And I can think of a couple of lifts in particular that I think back on, and it almost feels like an event. Like there's particular lifts that just kind of fire you up to see. So I think of like, I always loved the animal cage. So, Steffi Cohen, when I think she pulled 545 at, I think it was like 121. Sam Bird doing the 635 no hand squat, like those types of things. Are there any particular lifts or feats of strength top of mind that you think back of and you're like, that was some of the coolest shit that I ever saw, and that kind of just sticks with you as just like a fan of strength sports?
Yeah, well, one of the first ones that I found on the old Iron Game website before anything was on YouTube, I don't even think YouTube existed yet, was the title of the file for the video was the lightest 1,000 pound squat ever, and that was when Chuck Vogelpohl did it. I think he did like 1025 or something at 220, and that was really, really cool. And then I started seeing the lineage of that, because who was the first guy to do it in general in the competition? I keep forgetting his name on podcasts, and I can think of it any other time.
Can't
Lee
think of it off the
Moran.
top of my head.
Lee Moran.
Yes.
Yeah, his story of conquering 1,000 pounds in that meet is absolutely insane, because he missed it twice. Or I think he missed his opener, and then he jumped up to 1,000, and then he dumped it over his head, and it basically knocked him out, and blood was running down his head. Then he comes back for the third, and kills it. And that kind of sets the story. It gives the credence for valuing that lift. 'Cause, I mean, anybody in the metric system is like, why are you getting excited for 453 kilos or whatever it is?
Right.
But there's such a cool lineage, because the next guy that I remember doing it, and there's probably somebody in between, was Fred Hatfield. Fred Hatfield really captured my imagination a lot, because I started valuing the educational aspects of physiology and sport performance, because that was going to be my only real competitive edge. My genetics are good enough to make progress, but I was not gifted like a lot of the people that I would compete against, or that were breaking records and things like that. I was born with joint dysplasia, so I had that going against me. Physically, my muscle development didn't look like a lot of other people's, because it wasn't, those big round muscles that bodybuilders have, and people were born with that, and I just wasn't. I was like effectively skinny fat when I was a kid. So
there's hope. There's hope for me, is what you're saying.
Yeah, hopefully there's hope for everybody, right? But if you look at the pictures of me when I was a kid, there's one that I kept in my wallet for 25 years, since high school, of me flexing after my first day of lifting up in my grandfather's house. And all you see is loose skin in front of my pecs, because there's no muscle there. And instead of traps, you just see my shoulder blades sticking out over my shoulders. I'm flexing bone. But yeah, it's the educational part of that. When I saw Fred Hatfield do it, and I researched him, and all the training methodologies that he came up with, they're still really well founded today. I mean, there's only been increases in the validity by more research backing up what a lot of the things that he said. He didn't get 100% right, but nobody ever does. But like things like compensatory acceleration training and training intent, I mean, that was revolutionary for the time. He was talking about this stuff in the 80s. And we're still seeing more and more research with, muscle fiber biopsies showing that, the type 2X muscle fibers are highly proliferated with higher intents, more explosive lifting, and he nailed it. Spot on. And he walked the walk as well. And it's been funny, because I've had the moniker of doctor for several years now. And I had squat records, and every once in a while somebody will creep up and say, hey, you're like Dr. Squat. I'm like, you shut your mouth. There's only one of those. And he will forever be Dr. Fred Hatfield. But it went from Hatfield to Vogelpohl, and Hatfield had that record for God knows how long. It was a long, long time. And then you mentioned Sam Bird. I watched him do it. And I was like, I think I could sneak in there. Many, many years before it ever happened, I was talking to my buddy Will one day at the gym. I think it was right after Sam did that. I was still squatting somewhere in the sevens, at 165, 181, something like that. And I was like, if this, I'm seeing the progression pattern. I was like, I think if I gain this much weight at a decent rate, don't get sloppy fat, stay lean enough, I might be able to slide into that 1,000-pound realm with a really low body weight. And it ended up working out like that. So just visualization is a very powerful thing. If you believe you can do something, and especially if you have an idea of what it takes, it's very doable. Powerful thing.
It's really cool. So you mentioned Dr. Fred Hatfield. From the sounds of it, he was a little bit of a mentor. I don't know if you ever met him, but I'm curious if, like, in your younger years, was there a mentor or someone that stands out who really either gave you a nudge or a swift kick in the butt that you needed, a push, encouragement? Does anyone come to mind in like your younger years that really kind of paved the way for your journey so far?
Well, I never got to meet Dr. Hatfield. He was somebody that kind of existed on my periphery for a long time. By the time I really got into academia, I believe he'd already passed away. But there was a guy at the gym that I trained at right after I got out of high school and moved to Boone, North Carolina, and would eventually attend Appalachian State there. He knew Fred Hatfield. He actually brought Fred Hatfield to Boone in the 80s, and they were powerlifting together and doing all these things. So that was kind of cool. So it was kind of the mythos that followed me around of Fred Hatfield for a long time. But, I mean, if you want to go all the way back, my dad was a huge influence. He's always loved sports, and I saw the the respect and admiration that he had for greatness in athletics. And he used to tell me stories about all the mountain boys up in the hills of North Carolina that were they're farm strong. They could pick up engine blocks by themselves and, throw 150 pound bags of grain and or feed up into a high loft in a barn. Some just crazy stuff like that. So I got those mythological stories of sorts, and that kind of plants the seed for it. And I mean, I would be lying if this whole journey didn't have something to do with me just wanting to make my dad proud. Then you go on to my high school coach, Tom Harper. He was a guy that really framed what hard work could be in bringing intensity and also caring for the people around you. It's not the most common trait when you have somebody that's incredibly intense and incredibly competitive, but also deeply tries to ingrain in all the people that you work with. Love the people that you're around. Don't be afraid to tell them that you love them. You never know what's going to happen in the future. And even if that love is not reciprocated, then it's still worth it because you put something positive out there. And those things tend to come around quite a bit. So he was, I guess, more than just lifting, he was more of a life mentor in that way. But yeah, I mean, there's tons of people once I got into powerlifting as well. Laura Phelps, Brian Carroll, Al Caslow helped me quite a bit when I was in undergrad. I mean, he gave me equipment. Sometimes we may have had a few drinks beforehand that influenced his decision making, but it was greatly appreciated. But yeah, there was tons of stuff like that. I'm grateful for all of them.
So something I
Love it.
wanted to kind of pull on a little bit. You talked about some of Dr. Hatfield's sort of his methodology being more and more relevant even as time has gone on. Something I was thinking too is I look back at a guy like Ed Cohen, for example, probably the greatest powerlifter potentially that has lived. And I always remember him talking about the role that hypertrophy training played in his actual competitive career. I think he always called it like building armor. And you see kind of trends happen within the sport, like any other sport. There was a period of time where hyper specificity, even in raw lifting, kind of existed for a while. But when you start looking at, the guys that are actually men and women that are actually breaking world records, they're very, very like muscular people. I think of somebody like Dan Green, obviously Ed Cohen, so on and so forth. So I'm curious, what role do you think that, hypertrophy style training plays in competitive outcomes for strength sport?
Oh, huge. And it's actually a really good segue because I wanted to mention Dr. Mike Israetel, or as I call him, Misha. He's been one of my best friends for 17 years. I don't think a lot of people know that, unless they've heard me incessantly talk about it. But he was actually the first person that came up to me when I was powerlifting in 2007, probably. I think that's when we first met. And he said, your lifts are really impressive, but you don't really have much muscle. I think like long term, you're really going to have to add a lot more muscle to where you can actually have the functionality to do all these things, because pretty much everything I was training was neural at the time. I didn't really know that, but that's what it ended up being, and he was very right. And we ended up getting the same PhD education because he was another factor that went into pushing me to go to East Tennessee State, because he was getting his PhD there as well, and I went to go visit. And he said, what are you doing after you finish your undergrad at App State? It's like, I don't know, because I'd already kind of given up on everything with my career path, because I was very disillusioned with what strength conditioning was at the collegiate level. But he said, I really think if you don't try to go to this grad program, because it's catered to basically everything that you're passionate about, you may be wasting your entire life. I was like, you have my attention.
Yeah, no doubt.
And that's what led me down that road, and hypertrophy was a large part of that. Mike's kind of known for that deal. And watching him train back in the day when I was just a young pup, and he was too, we were at totally different ends of the spectrum. We were training at the same times a lot of time, but I hope that he was able to to get something from me in that time, but I know I definitely got a lot from him because he exposed me to what I would eventually need to really focus on a ton, which was that hypertrophy stimulus. And I think of a lot of physiological principles and performance as an aspect of capacity and your ability to perform specific traits within capacity. And you can think of absolute strength as one, like your maximum deadlift. You're never going to do a power clean with more than you can just deadlift. Like the most I've ever heard of that with specifically trained weightlifters is like 80% of their best deadlift. And you're also not going to be as strong as you could be with the same neural adaptations unless you just gain more muscle. Muscle is like that total capacity to some degree, depending on your genetics especially. And it's different for everyone. But once you max out your neural adaptations with a certain amount of muscle mass, the only way to really get stronger is to gain more muscle mass. So you increase your capacity and your ability to progress later on. So you're definitely spot on there.
So it's interesting, so once again, like you're looking into your story, how would I say this? It seems like you have a very broad breadth of sports and activities that you partake in. And Ryan, I'm happy that you teed this up because this is something I wanted to talk to you, Derek, about, which is how to reconcile like the benefit of general training as a means of driving very specific outcomes. Because naturally, I mean, we understand that specificity in some ways is king. Like it's essential at a certain point. Like if you want to do a thing, you have to practice a thing and you need to do the thing at a certain point. But there is also value seemingly in being a generalist, being kind of competent in a broad breadth of sports competencies, et cetera. So I was kind of curious how you work through that. How do you work through, let's say you're working with an athlete, let's say, or someone who wants to peak for a competition. At which point might you say, listen, you know what, like we need to take a step back and really focus on general physical preparation and then go through more specific blocks of training tapering towards your sport? How do you work through that kind of stuff?
I make very similar analogies to what I just did. When I explain to an athlete that it's not their specific skill in whatever that they are doing that is really holding them back, like they're, technically sound, all of the details that are sport specific to what they're doing is really good, but they're never going to be, as fast as they could be at a current body weight unless they get stronger. Strength, to quote Dr. Mike Stone, is the vehicle that brings all other traits with it. It is literally the capacity for you to be explosive. It is the capacity for you to have endurance, because endurance is still a measure of your physical force output relative to your body weight in some regard. And if your body weight requires less effort to move or do any activity with, your endurance by default is going to improve as well. And I talk about this in jiu-jitsu a lot. There are the three big factors of endurance for jiu-jitsu, just as an example of what you're talking about. One is skill. That's the biggest one. How efficient you are in moving your body with skill and leverages and things like that. Then you have your cardiovascular attributes. That one's pretty self-explanatory. But the other one that is drastically overlooked is the concept of strength reserve. If your ability to move someone else's body, or especially your own body, is 60 to 70% effort with any given move, just as an arbitrary standard, and you get stronger, that same exact move, that same result is going to be less. It could be 40 to 50%. If you get extremely strong, it could become 25 to 35%. So you still have a lower relative effort to do the exact same things, so it's not costing you anywhere near as much of your overall expenditure. So I think the strength reserve is something that's incredibly overlooked, and a lot of movement-based people in the training world seem to avoid talking about that to a large degree.
Yeah, really interesting. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of build off of that. And I think when you look at almost any sport, if there is even close to a non just skill based component. I'm excluding things like darts.
I was literally just thinking of throwing darts.
I was like, maybe strength doesn't matter
Might
that
be
much
the
there,
exception, yeah.
but you almost always will see somebody where strength can, to a certain degree, maybe make up a skill discrepancy.
Absolutely.
Obviously, depending on the size of that, maybe not. But I think of a story that I had heard, and hopefully I get this pretty close to correct. Chad Wesley Smith, when he got into Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, I believe I'd heard in a podcast a few years ago, he was still just learning the sport, wasn't particularly skillful at it. And he would just like grab someone's arm and move it where he wanted. And they're like, well, like that's not really a move, but also you're a bear and you can move anybody where you want to. Mm-hmm. And that was where like it didn't matter how skillful he was. He just overpowered every other person that he fought, essentially. I think of, I'm a big basketball guy. I think of a guy like Shaq, obviously more skillful than people probably give him credit for. But there's a reason why, any video you look up of Shaq, he's just bullying everybody in the paint. It didn't matter who you were. He was just going to knock you out of the way.
A lot of people just bounced off of him too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think Kobe actually at one point said that, like, bar none, if Shaq worked harder, he would have been the best basketball player of all time. And I'm assuming it's because of those physical attributes. And there was an interview. He's like, oh yeah, I told Shaq that all the time. He's a lazy motherfucker. And he's like, if he just worked harder, he would have just like smoked everyone. But, from a work ethic perspective, he just wasn't able to show up as consistently as someone like Kobe or Jordan.
Yeah, you never know with that stuff. If somebody like him worked harder with the load on his joints and ligaments and things like that, he may have just gotten more injured. So
true.
It's always hard to say.
Very true. Pulling on this thread of sports performance and strength, et cetera, I had a thought earlier today, once again, in preparation for today. I was like, I wonder if there are any sports that you would be really interested, or any athletes that you'd be really interested in working with that are, that perform in sports that you have zero past experience and competency in. Like, is there anything that is of interest to you at this point when it comes to your coaching career?
That's a tough one. I kind of had that experience with disc golf in the last several years. Basically since COVID started, that sport exploded. I think it quadrupled in size since COVID than it
with
was
disc golf.
for
Okay,
like
interesting.
previous 30 years, or longer than that. But the mechanics of disc golf were completely backwards from everything else that I'd ever done. All the throwing sports that I've done involved rotating forward on my right side. Whether it was, like a shot put or a discus style throw, the weights that we throw in the Highland Games are more resembling a discus and everything else like that. So learning how to backhand throw a disc was super foreign to me. And I was looking at it and it didn't make sense. And I got so excited because I'm sorry to curse on here, but I have analyzed the absolute dog shit out of the biomechanics of so many different sports, whether it's tennis, soccer, basketball, football, baseball. And there's so many mechanical principles that go into all of those sports that are paralleled that when I looked at disc golf, I was like, wait a minute. I see some familiar things here, but there are variables that I've never seen move this way. Same thing in a golf swing. And golf strength and conditioning is one of my specialties. I worked with the men's golf team at ETSU for 5 years. We were the top 25 team in the country back then. I love golf anyway. I've played since I could stand up. So diving into the mechanics of that was great, but it was also backwards from disc golf as far as throwing a backhand. So the shoulder and hip separation, things like that, is still one of the most important things to create torque and power in a throw. But the application from the ground up was a lot different. So when I saw that and got to dive into it, I was very excited. Honestly, I've looked at so many other sports, I don't know what sport's left. Like maybe badminton to some degree, but we also have lots of parallels to pitching mechanics in badminton with an overhead strike. On the shuttlecock, which is the greatest term in sports.
Tell us more about the shuttlecock, Dr. Derek.
It's just a tremendous series of syllables for sports. You just want to hear a sports commentator talk about it more and more. It's just a good time. I haven't played badminton in a long time. Watching high level badminton is another crazy thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
high level badminton, high level ping pong. Like,
I believe the smash in badminton is the fastest shot in all of sports.
Yeah. But I
Yeah,
would imagine it's also the fastest decelerating
I
because you could
imagine
hit
so
that
as
thing
well.
300 miles an hour and goes whoop, and it just stops and falls.
right, right. Go
So
ahead, Brian.
something I was curious about, you're talking about all these sports, and one thing they all have in common, and you sort of alluded to it already, was this rotational component. So especially, obviously, throwing of any kind, swinging of any kind. I wanted to know where, if you're like training an athlete or coaching an athlete, if you have like general strength and conditioning. So if we're talking like, prominently sagittal plane work, from there, where would you differ when you're starting to train an athlete for sport in terms of how do you encompass that like rotational component?
Most of the people in those sports already rotate incredibly well because they've been doing the sport and practicing the skills for so long. If you watch high level golfers or disc golfers, tennis players as well, anything that really revolves around the force production of creating shoulder and hip separation, it is driven through the legs. That separation only connects kinetically the top and lower half. You're not actually generating that much force by uncorking that. That happens after the legs and the hips have been pushed through. So there's a parallel in every sport with that. So that the drive comes from the ground up in sequence. But the way that I approach that is first you have to assess, can they separate? Do they separate well? Are they stable? Those are the biggest things. And nothing brings that out like load. Having them do a side throw with a medicine ball, something simple like that. Do their upper body mechanics function, essentially? Past that, if they've already got those traits, which most of them do, or they're going to develop just by getting better at their sport, it really just comes down to their strength capacity again, because most of them are limited by that. I've loved working with golfers. Oh my God. It's one of my favorite things in the world. The head coach for ETSU back in the day actually changed his recruiting protocols. So he started finding smaller and smaller people with incredible short games because he knew when they went through our program that their distances were going to go way, way up. And part of that was just them physically developing anyway. But the confidence and the consistency that he had in our strength conditioning program was something that was really special to me. And it meant a lot that he had that confidence, but it also told me, okay, this process is very, very real. And it's very predictable and it's repeatable. So that's what really directed how I coached other rotational sports. Do they have the foundations physically to execute their techniques properly? Now let's build up their strength capacity and then eventually their explosiveness within that capacity.
So you talk about this kind of separation between like upper extremity and lower extremity, or like thorax and pelvis, perhaps. I'm not sure if that would be the right way to describe it, but I was hoping that maybe you could just kind of double click on that to make sure that the listeners and also myself fully understand what you're talking about. And then, but also I'm curious, we've been talking a lot about athletics, but when it comes to working with Gen Pop, people that just want to move and feel better, look better naked, get stronger, etc. Have you found that you prioritize similar things when it comes to driving athletic performance and also Gen Pop, or are those very different approaches generally, of course?
Yeah, well, to cover the shoulder and hip separation thing, when you twist your shoulders to one side or the other, where your chest is facing to the left or the right, and you leave your hips in the same place, you're creating separation, especially if you look from the top down. You can see that pretty clearly. In golf, they call it an X factor. But the more separation you can get in that dynamic, the tighter all the muscles throughout your torso become. So instead of them being loose and your legs and hips driving through in a rotational movement, and those muscles are loose, it's like trying to throw something with a rubber band attached to it, versus when those muscles are tight and you have tons of separation. Those muscles are so tight, there's so much tension, it's more like throwing something with a metal chain. So the transfer of force from what's moving all the way to the end of the object, whether it's a tennis racket, shot put, discus, whatever, golf club especially. It's so much more efficient, and it takes less effort to have really good results in that regard. So that's where the technical aspect of that comes. If you have more muscle through your torso with the same degree of rotation, you actually have more efficient force transfer as well, which is why we can improve the throws of people without doing any rotational work most of the time. If you have somebody that's very thin, you increase their muscle mass through their torso with compound movements like squats and deadlifts. The mechanical transfer of force from the lower body to the upper body becomes higher in magnitude and more efficient all at the same time. You've got two different factors leading into higher performance to a very significant degree. Now, with general public, if they want sport-specific training, we can definitely do it. I do golf swing assessments all the time to look at mechanics, and we can work in specific mobility that helps fix a lot of different issues in golf swings, and it also parallels to tons of other sports as well. But funny enough, the human body tends to work very similarly through different tasks. We've only got a certain amount of tools to use there, and they all kind of function the same way. So, but I don't have to work on rotational stuff very much with Gen Pop. One of the biggest things that I do is make sure that they improve their end range of motion strength by using full range of motion exercises, especially compound movements. That's a really high priority, and I actually focus a ton on posture strength, stability, and hip mobility because those things are very, very intertwined. So many of my clients have sedentary jobs where they're sitting down a lot, and when we have that, we have lower back inhibition from development and lots of atrophy that leads to glute atrophy. So if you ever see old men where their pants fall down all the time if they don't have suspenders on, they prescribe no acetol pills. That's where that comes from. We lose our low back functionality, and our low back is incredibly important for pulling our hips into at least neutral, possibly anterior tilt to engage the glutes and hamstrings properly. So once the low back goes, the glutes start going, the hamstrings start going, the entire chain starts to fail over time and degrade, and that's where low back injuries come from most of the time, and hamstring pulls as well. It's also incredibly important for the elderly to avoid big falls, because once that whole complex goes down, they're incredibly more susceptible to like breaking a hip, any kind of fall, that injury you can think of, it's going to happen. Those dynamics I think are incredibly important, probably overlooked, and I focus on that with everyone because it's not just about body composition change. We can work on that stuff all day and ignore the long term. But my number one priority as a coach, not as a competitor, but as a coach, is to improve the quality of life of the people that I work with. Doesn't matter if that means going after world records and Olympic medals, or if it's just getting off the couch and being able to play with your grandkids. My goal is the quality of life improvement. And honestly, it's kind of all the same to me because I don't see one person's venture in physical training or competition or everyday life as more important than the other, because happiness is happiness.
I have one quick follow-up question, if you don't mind. It's you talked about working through a large range of motion. It sounded like you were perhaps referencing more so with compound movements, like you're working through a large range of motion at the hips, knees, the upper extremity, etc. Do you focus on trying to load people through a really large range of motion through various trunk movements as well, or is it more so bracing focused in your practice?
It's more bracing focused. If you can properly brace, you're developing all those muscles through the abdomen and torso that will make your separation and rotational movements much, much stronger. You actually don't have to separate as much to create the same amount of force. If you ever watch a video of me throwing a disc and compare it to a professional disc golfer, I cannot throw as far as those people. I work with Haley King, who is like 115 pounds, same height as me, and just a young lady. She throws the disc, 75 feet, 100 feet farther than what I can. But her range of motion on her reach back and the total distance that she is applying force to the disc is probably 4 times longer than what I can do because I'm limited mobility-wise. Compared to her, I look like a fire hydrant out on the disc golf course. I can't hardly get the disc past my back shoulder to get a reach back and then have the range of motion to apply force to it. So I have to put force into the disc, a quarter as long as she can. That's why we have super thin, incredibly lanky pros that can throw the disc a million miles, and they don't necessarily have to be that strong to do it. Same thing with somebody like Randy Johnson. Randy Johnson did not need to develop a ton of muscle to throw a 103 mile an hour fastball because he was 6'10". The physics work out real good in his department for that. It's just one of those circumstances where you work with what you've got. Outside of that, it's just general traits of improving strength that really help rotational sports in general. It's a little bit redundant from the Department of Redundancy, but I don't know. It's just one of those deals where rotational work doesn't really benefit general public as much unless they're having to go through that for something like their work. And being able to brace is much more important as far as injury prevention and total strength.
Fascinating.
So I had two questions sort of unrelated to one another. The first, just because we are still talking about kind of the rotational component, which I actually find is a fascinating part of athletic movements.
Definitely.
You mentioned Randy Johnson. I'm a massive baseball fan. And I don't know how much you follow the sport, but I believe most recently the statistic is that 35% of pitchers on major league rosters have had Tommy John surgery.
Yep.
I'm curious what your opinion is on, I guess, do you think that there's a potential to reduce that elbow injury risk with improved mechanics throwing? And B, potentially, do you think that maybe we're just headed that way with the sport because of the pressure for all these guys to throw 100, 102? Do you think it's just kind of a byproduct of the amount of force that these guys are producing?
Yeah, well, culturally, baseball, from the little leagues over the last 20, 30 years, there was a gigantic and very harmful misnomer in that culture where people, particularly parents, sometimes coaches, would see a major league pitcher. They would be throwing 90, then they would tear the UCL. They would get Tommy John surgery, and after they rehabbed it and got trained back up, they were throwing 97, 98. And that one circumstance that was pretty easy to see consistently because it wasn't that moment that tore the UCL. It was the chronic overuse of the throwing mechanics over time that degraded the UCL, made it looser, frayed it. It eventually got thinner. When you're degrading that tissue specifically, you are losing force transfer, even if all the force output up the chain is exactly the same. You're just going to have a lower velocity. But people just saw the end result. Like, oh, they had the surgery, they threw faster. And then there was a rash of Tommy John surgeries in little leagues and high school and sometimes college where people thought if they just get that reinforced tendon through the UCL, the Tommy John surgery, they're going to add, 5 miles an hour to their fastball. Like, nope. They were functioning at a deficit before that. And I think we're still on the very tail end of that problem. I think it's gotten a lot better because little leagues and other leagues started instituting pitch counts for the pitchers. People still get around it with travel ball, and so they'll go with one sanctioning body one weekend, and then halfway through the week be throwing with, pitching again with another sanctioning body that keeps their own pitch counts. And technically, they're working inside the rules for each one, but it's violating the intent for keeping the kids safe. So I think what you're talking about is going to get drastically better because the data is out there now. People understand what that dynamic is. The changes started to be instituted. And I'm hoping that the mythology around Tommy John surgery is going away and people are seeing it as just a fix to return to what was normal before instead of some kind of performance benefit.
So from what I understand, so I hadn't really heard of, I mean, I knew of Tommy John surgery, but I'm not as much of an avid baseball fan as Ryan and I'm assuming yourself, Derek. But what I'm gathering is that at younger ages, they're establishing, like you said, pitch count. So the maximum amount of pitches you can perhaps do during a season as a means of decreasing injury risk. Did I understand that correctly?
It's more per game, and then that lasts for
Okay.
a certain amount of days, so they're not accumulating more volume so that the kid can actually recover. Because parents, there were lots of stories of parents just having their kids pitch crazy amounts of volumes in multiple games in a week to actually try and get the injury so they could have the surgery, because they thought that that was the key to get them to the league. So many people in the league had the surgery, but it was more of a symptom instead of the cause.
Yeah, there was kind of a notion, if you were somebody who was almost certainly going to get drafted, you may as well get Tommy John by the end of high school or in college ball, rehab it so that you were fresh. Yeah, that maybe within like 5 or 10 years ago, that was a really prevailing kind of idea. Now we're a little bit more on the, pitch count side of things, load management, as people like to call it. I also know a newer surgery that's come up is what they call the internal brace, which is a different type of surgery than Tommy John. I forget exactly what it was. So actually Shohei Ohtani, who's not been pitching this year, technically didn't get a second Tommy John surgery. He had an internal brace surgery, which is also supposedly going to lead to improved outcomes as well. But I think, I'm picking on baseball, but I think chronic injury happens in any sport. I think the elbow, like the UCL tears in baseball, is such a big one and it's so common. So it's really easy to see. But I think, you see this, I think hockey went through this 15 years ago with concussions. We talked about this in our last podcast. There are prevalent injuries in each sport that you just see coming up over and over and over again, that hopefully eventually we get enough data and the right people in place to, at least try to mitigate those injury risks. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Derek, maybe common injuries across certain sports and maybe your thoughts on what we can best do, as sort of strength and conditioning people to help with that.
Yeah, well, I was intimately involved with that kind of thing with powerlifting, and coming up in powerlifting, like the common assumption was, injuries just happen, that's just part of the game, and that's, there's nothing you can do about it. And then when I started, especially going through my master's degree and really solidified it in my doctorate with sport physiology, I had no idea what a gigantic load of horseshit that was. People just did not either accept that there were variables that played into that, or they just ignored them because they had injuries, and they were probably preventable. Most of them are. The biggest aspect of that is fatigue management, because when you are highly fatigued, you are less structurally sound, and you have a higher tendency of tearing muscles. When the muscles are too weak, forces are transferred to connective tissue like ligaments. When you see somebody on a football field, or particularly female soccer players, running at full speed and then having to break down really quickly, decelerate, causing a huge output from the quadricep that pulls on the front of the tibia, and if their hamstrings are not strong enough, it will put all the stress on the ACL and pop that there. Getting run into is not something that you can really help. Somebody just tackles you right on top of your knee. So that is part of the game, all the different games. But non-contact injuries particularly are not just part of the game per se, in the way that it's said. There are so many variables that, like fatigue management and especially athlete monitoring, can help prevent to a very large degree, because we have the information now. We understand what those dynamics are. Sports scientists, that's one of their highest priorities. It's not always just to increase performance, but it's to keep people healthy. It's to avoid those catastrophic injuries. And that was one of the biggest things that I learned to do in my career, because my joints were already really bad. So I knew a catastrophic injury was just around the corner if I pushed things too hard, and learning how to properly periodize and waive my training went into the little bit of longevity that I had in powerlifting. I implemented those things myself, and like most of my education in physiology and kinesiology, it was completely self-serving for me to be a better competitor. But to learn those things at a deep, passionate level, because it completely served me in the most selfish way, it meant more to accumulate the information and the knowledge and learn from the wisdom of others. And now I get to pass that to other people. And I always encourage anybody who's looking for a coach to find those traits. Find the people that went and got educated because they wanted to improve themselves, because the quality of information uptake is going to be much higher because it's for completely greedy, selfish reasons.
So I was just going to say, I think that's a really good segue into another question that we had, talking about recovery specifically. So I wanted to know, in your eyes, what are sort of like the main pillars of recovery? And something that I think is interesting to talk about as well is not necessarily what to add to recovery, as I think a lot of like type A people might do, but what are the main things that people can remove to reduce kind of their stressors?
Yeah, you're lightly touching on one of the biggest dynamics in sports. Like if you're winning, well, we need to do more so we keep winning. Or if you're losing, like, oh, we need to do more so we don't lose so much. Like, the answer is always do more, and that's definitely not always the right answer. It's the default. The biggest thing that you can do for recovery, one is sleep, obviously. Nutrition is right there with that. But changing and hopefully avoiding stressors outside of what you're doing plays a profound effect. It's probably overlooked quite a bit, because if anybody has ever worked with high school athletics or college athletics, you think on paper, hypothetically, you are getting these talented athletes with all these physical traits that will be able to respond to training in a specific manner. And if we sequence these things all correctly and they have good nutrition, we're going to be able to get X, Y, and Z output, especially after 4 years in a good D1 strength conditioning program. And what people tend to forget is these are people. These are still basically kids. They are going through the struggles of developing as humans in this society. And that comes with an immense amount of stress, especially with social media now, creating all kinds of forms of anxiety that we didn't know could even exist. And then on top of that, you add in relationship stress, trying to navigate that as somebody that's 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. I mean, that stuff's incredibly brutal. You're losing sleep. You're chronically anxious. Your stress hormones are elevated. And if you don't look at the people that you're working with, athletes or not, doesn't even matter if they're a professional, or if you don't see them as people first, you will never, ever properly see them as athletes.
There's one of my friends, Paris Stu, the slogan for her business is people first, athlete second, or human first, athlete second. And I very much agree, and it's like, and this applies in business. This applies, as I'm understanding, and I think you would agree, it applies in sport, that it's like these people are not machines. We're not racing robots. We're not pitting robots against each other. These are people. They're squishy on the inside. They might have a hard exterior, but they're squishy, and they have emotions, and like they're susceptible to these things. And due to the interdependency of the human organism, like one thing, for instance, in like going awry at home can wreak havoc on your ability to throw a discus, and this for me reminds me, earlier you were talking about how early on in your studies, there were some moments where you were disillusioned with the S&C industry. And I remember in one of the interviews that I listened of you recently, you touched on how with some of the things that you were noticing that like ethically you just weren't on board. And there were some things that were just outright wrong when it came to like athlete health. And I would be really curious to kind of hear you perhaps expand on that a little bit. Like, what were perhaps some things that you noticed at that time that initially disillusioned you with the strength and conditioning world?
Sure. For the listeners here, that specific case, to try and keep it relatively short, was my goal was to be a strength conditioning coach in general. Coming out of high school, I always knew that that's what I wanted to do professionally. And as soon as I got exposed to that world through different programs, and I won't name names, but I started seeing that the practices in weight rooms drastically contradicted like some of the most basic tenets of what good training was. And the people that were in charge were not really very well educated, and they displayed that on a frequent occasion. And it was to the detriment of the athletes that they were working with. And it goes back to the fatigue management and things like that we talked about earlier that can really cause, or the lack of fatigue management can cause a higher rate of injury. And I was running into head strength and conditioning coaches that all they did was scream and yell inside the weight room to be motivators. And they would say things like, I don't believe in rest between sets. I don't believe, everything that you're doing as far as a failure in your training and your sport is 100% mental. And, I didn't telekinetically tear someone's hamstring. It's not mental in that way. Sometimes it is actually physical. So,
right.
And
right.
The thing that depressed me so much about it, one, they got paid really high salaries to do the absolute crappiest job possible. Not just they didn't do it well. They were an active detriment to so many people that they worked with. And the more I saw of that, I was like, clearly this career path is not what I thought it was. So I gave up. I was like, this is clearly, this doesn't even exist. It's not even a real thing. There are not professionals in strength conditioning that are largely successful based on merit. It was purely based on who they knew and what coaches were comfortable with them and the networking and things like that. And it just seemed like so much horseshit. And eventually that's what East Tennessee State University's sports science program was designed to fix. It's a coach's education program. And we literally have coaches college every year there, and it's an amazing group of lecturers that cover those kinds of issues and how give everyone tools to try and combat those things. So that really turned everything around to me when I knew that what I saw wasn't just me, because I felt like I was a lunatic. Like, how is nobody else seeing this? Everybody still wants to be strength conditioning coaches. What is wrong with me? And then I met, Doc Stone and Meg Stone, who had seen everything that I'd seen a million times over, and were actively trying to do their best to fix those things in the entire industry. So super grateful for them.
I think something that's come up a handful of times on this podcast, but I think is always relevant, and you were sort of talking about it there, is the power and the role that a coach has with communication. So an example, a story that I always like because it's sort of a funny one. A client of mine who's a bikini competitor, so I'm actually staying in their condo right now because she just competed this weekend. Did her, very, very lovely putting me up here. Vancouver's a beautiful city, but so she did her first prep this year. She competed this weekend, won 3 golds, so obviously did very well. And early on in our prep process, she had sort of a high day. I gave her like a single free meal at the end of the day, which turned into, she basically was like, if I don't ever stop eating, it actually sounds like a Dave Tate story, but if she never stopped eating, then it was just the same meal. So she, so it was like Doritos. So I was like, oh boy, okay. But this happens, like, especially for newer competitors. And I remember, and we had actually discussed it this weekend. So I had read that, and I was really cautious with how I wanted to approach it. Because how I responded to that situation, I knew would dictate the relationship going forward. And if you're an athlete, you need to trust your coach and think that they have your best interest in mind. So even she had said see typing, stop, typing, because I was like, I need to make sure I say this in the way that, obviously, like, this behavior isn't conducive to being a good bodybuilder, but treat her like a human being and like not make her feel bad. So I tell that story just to use it as a segue for you maybe to tell any stories or maybe give some insight into the role that communication as a coach plays in not just the client, liking you as a person or trusting you, but legitimately their outcomes as an athlete.
Yeah, communication is absolutely paramount. There were a lot, because when I went through the grad program that I was talking about, I was a little bit older. I took the scenic route through undergrad, and had several years off just to work and save money and train, as I was still competing in powerlifting really heavily through that time. But once I got to grad school, I was around a lot of people who were 5, 6, 7 years younger than me, who hadn't been doing really much personal training, hadn't really worked with the athletes that they were being introduced to, because that was a big part of the program. You immediately get put on a strength conditioning staff for a team somewhere. And that's kind of half the job in that program. It's a lot of hours, but it's very worth it. And I had to stop so many people, especially when I took on a supervisor role there. Like, I had to explain, like, look, I know that you think what we're learning in class right now and what the research that we're doing in the lab, which is very extensive and very important, all these things are extremely time consuming, and it's easy to go down every rabbit hole available in that side of it. But as soon as you walk out of this lab, you go to that weight room. Everything that you're learning in class is maybe 10% of what coaching is. 90% of coaching is the art of dealing with people. So you take that 10% and you work it into your craft and your skill of trying to get an athlete to follow all those physiological principles. We get those specific training adaptations and stimulus that you're trying to get out of them. But the trick is, how do you do that in an abstract manner that makes sense to them? Nobody gives a shit about what you know. They want to see results. So you got to figure out how to manufacture those things. And I've always joked that you can always tell an experienced coach from a new coach by how little or how much they say. A new coach will absolutely cue you into next week, trying to explain how you should do everything and every little detail. An experienced coach, a lot of times, most experienced coaches I was around, they would give you an analogy. Like, if you were taking a dump in the woods, how would you squat? And then it just clicks, like they want them to sit back a little bit more. So, just little things like that. It's not about what you say, it's about how you say it most of the time to get things to resonate. Because everybody's sat down on a toilet at some point or another. So if you want those similar mechanics, it's like, hey, well, when you go to the bathroom, how do you do that? Because they know that motor pattern real well. At least I hope they do. Hopefully everybody makes it to the toilet on time. It's just
for what it's worth, I overhead squat to the toilet.
So. Oh, that's beautiful. I respect that so much. But yeah, it's things like that. And honestly, the more funny or raunchy or however you want to describe those things, the more ridiculous the coaching cues are, the better they're remembered. So I get to have fun making up the most ridiculous shit ever to tell athletes, get a good laugh out of them, but they're going to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of, like, when it comes to my professional development as of late, I've been looking into storytelling classes, because not only when it comes to business with what we're working towards as an educational initiative with the exercise mechanic, but also when it comes to, like, in the trenches with clients, getting them to understand the thing that you're trying to get them to understand very often requires storytelling. I'm really happy that you touched on that. You mentioned on numerous occasions. Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that takes a lot of skill. That's not necessarily something you can learn in a book. It takes, like, stumbling through that and learning by trial and error. I don't know if you would agree.
100%. I mean, some people are more gifted at it than others. Some people are just born orators. But you have to find some kind of common ground. You have to understand something that they do. And you find your common ground and you build off of that. I mean, general public people, if I've got a mechanic, I can make analogies to cars all day, mirroring physiology. The nervous system is your ignition system. Your fuel system is your nutrition uptake. All these other different things. And I also just love motorsports. One of my clients is Clay Milliken's top fuel dragster driver. I get to go to races with him and do sports sciencey things with my partner, Dr. Kayla Haraldser. And that's been one of the most rewarding things ever. But it was taking all those sports science principles and removing them, working with a completely demographic, and then having to figure out how to communicate within those parameters. Trying to explain sports science to motorsports people, to car people. Drivers are just born in that world, you know. They just think, oh, he was born to do this. Actually, there's a whole lot of trained traits that can be improved on for drivers. The driver is my car. I am the mechanic on the driver. Unfortunately, I cannot put tools inside the driver to fix things, but it's still the same kind of dynamic. I'm tuning on the driver here and there with nutrition and training and things like that. But I think that dynamic is really overlooked. But to your point about communication, you want to get outside your comfort zone, leave sports in a traditional sense in general, and try to apply that coaching practice to people who don't hardly even like sports. They just like cars.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of the mechanical piece, you've alluded on numerous occasions the depth of your study when it comes to biomechanics, and I'm assuming by extension anatomy. How relevant and how important, in your opinion, is developing a sound anatomical understanding for fitness professionals and coaches, and then also by extension developing at least a surface level understanding of some biomechanical principles, specifically for personal trainers?
If you're going to be a professional in the fitness industry, it's an ethical requirement. Because if you don't understand the pieces, parts that you are working with, you're not just not going to be good at what you do. Any success that you have cannot be attributed to the methods and the reasons that you thought that they were happening, because you don't have the understanding required to replicate it or explain it. That's the nice side of it. The other side of it, on the other end of the spectrum, is you are an inherent risk to everyone that you work with, because you are by definition a biomechanical anatomical idiot. But you have a lot of power in that moment. So if you don't take that responsibility incredibly seriously to get an education in what you're doing, then to me that is incredibly corrupt ethically. And that could be from ignorance. Most of the time it is. But once you hear this, ignorance is no longer an excuse. Get educated. Don't be a hazard to the people that you're working.
Hear, hear. Ryan, I don't know if there's any other questions that you wanted to ask Dr. Derek before we get into our rapid fire.
I'm good for rapid fire if you are.
Derek, you ready for rapid fire?
Let's go.
All right, let's let it rip.
So we do this at the end of each podcast. 10 questions. First thing that pops on the top of your head, we won't talk about it, and then on to the next. Cool?
Fair warning, I am Southern. So from the Southeast America, if you hear how fast I'm talking, I also listen at about the same speed, and I think a little slower than that.
Okay.
So I'm going to do my best, but rapid fire is not my forte.
We'll go moderate fire.
Okay.
Medium fire, yeah.
Medium fire, yeah.
All right, question 1. What is your favorite book, movie, and concert?
Oh, Good Omens is my favorite book. Army of Darkness I'll go with for my favorite movie. And concert was probably Lamb of God at the Orange Peel in Asheville, North Carolina many years ago. Very small venue.
Nice.
Let's go.
Question 2. Favorite and least favorite food?
Oh, man. In my world, food is a tool, but I'll go with chicken parmesan as my favorite, and my least favorite being a raw onion.
Question 3. Proudest moment outside of business?
Outside of business, marrying my wife. Absolutely.
4. Favorite sporting moment of all time, whether it be as an athlete or a fan?
That's a really tough one. The feeling I had when I broke the world record at 181 was cathartic for me. It was every bit of me as a young teenager all the emotions that built up from that time up to that moment in search of validation for me as a person and everything I was passionate about in life, it all came out in that moment, and I don't think I'll be able to top that one.
Question 5, what 3 values guide you?
The golden rule is the first one. I'm a big, huge believer in treating others as you would have them treat you. If they treat you poorly, then do unto others before they do unto you. That would be number 2. Critical thinking would be the third, because I think that is something that's largely lost in society, being fed morality. And in my opinion, regardless of what your beliefs are in life, religious, political, whatever it is, your life is what you make it, and your morality reflects directly on you.
Question 6, favorite and least favorite lift?
My favorite lift would actually be deadlift. I think it is inherently the best, even though I'm nowhere near as good at that as squats. Least favorite, probably curls. That's probably why I didn't do them for over a decade.
Something you and Ryan have in common, I think.
Oh, I know. Question 7, one misconception about you.
I'm not tall. Everybody that I meet that have only seen me on the internet, folks, I'm 5'6". I am exponentially squished from all the weights over the years. So I'm not 6'2" or whatever you might think I am.
Question 8, favorite vacation spot?
Well, it's been fresh in my mind because of all the storm damage, but Asheville, North Carolina. It's where I got married. It's where we vacationed a ton, and that place is basically destroyed right now. So my heart breaks for everyone up in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee.
I saw some photos. It's devastating.
Entire towns are gone.
Question 9, city or country that you'd love to visit that you haven't?
It's a tie between Scotland and Iceland, because I want to go through in the Highland Games there, and I love the cultures. That's kind of where my heritage comes from, more Norse than Scottish, but yeah.
And our final question, question 10, what is one hard truth that personal trainers need to hear?
You are not in charge. And by that, I mean the person that is paying you for your time and services, they are the CEO. You work for them. So framing that is what I do in every regard. I explain to my clients, like, I can give you my best suggestions. A coach is a little bit different because they have responsibility if you're on their team, like you're working for them. But if you are working for a client, you do not control them whatsoever. So they are the CEO. You put your input in and understand that at the end of the day, everything is their decision.
There's a really interesting, you reminded me of one of my favorite quotes, and my wife's in the other room. So if she hears this, she's going to be rolling her eyes so hard. She's going to do a back somersault, which is that there's a quote from one of my favorite movies, which is The Guardian with Ashton Kutcher, and Kevin Costner. I don't know if you've seen it. It's about rescue swimmers. And there's a moment in that movie where a student asks Kevin Costner, how do you choose who lives and who dies? Because Kevin Costner is like the GOAT of rescue swimming, has like 200 something saves, what have you. And his answer for me has actually turned into like a guiding principle in my life, which is you swim as hard as you can for as long as you can, and then the sea takes the rest. What I love about that is it's this statement that reminds me of like how sometimes we view hard work, doing the best you can, as being mutually exclusive with acceptance and relinquishing control of the outcome. And I think that what you talked about there, which I love, it's such an important reminder that you're not in charge. The client is the CEO. You're there to do your best, to remind them, to guide them as best you can. And at a certain point, like you said, you're not in charge. You need to be able to let go. I think that's a really, really great reminder. So for those that are interested in either learning more about you or perhaps working with you in a coaching context, how could they do both of those things?
You can reach out to me on Instagram. I'm at Wilcox Strength Inc. there. You can look up coaching at rpstrength.com or wilcoxstrengthinc.com. Everything funnels back to the same place for coaching services. My biography is on both websites. But yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. I would love getting messages from people. One of my big tenets for all my clients, I have 2 big rules. 1, don't ever hesitate to ask questions about what we're doing because it only benefits both of us long term. And number 2, don't apologize for asking too many damn questions. You can't. Bring it on. So I invite everyone to do so.
I love that. Ryan, do you have any closing thoughts, closing questions, remarks?
No, I just wanted to say thank you for coming on here. It was a treat.
You guys are a blast. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And I second what Ryan said. Derek, thank you so much for your time. I learned a lot from you today, and it was also nice just getting to know you as a human being first and an athlete second. Little wink back to one of the themes of the episode. I really appreciate your time today, and hopefully it won't be the last time that we connect on this medium. And best of luck with all of your future endeavors.
Well, same to you guys. It's a lot of fun. If you have the lapse in judgment to want me on again, I will gladly do it.
Absolutely. Well, I'm known for my lapse in judgment, so we'll make that happen for sure. All right, buddy. We'll talk soon. Thank you so much.
Take care, guys.
Bye-bye.
That's all right.